The chamber of the Galactic Council had witnessed countless moments of historic significance across its 7,000-year existence, but none would compare to the events that unfolded on that particular day. Ambassador Chen Wei stood before the assembled delegates, her posture as composed as ever, hands clasped gently behind her back as she listened to the accusations being leveled against her species. The Valerian High Magistrate's voice echoed through the crystalline dome, each word carefully chosen to wound, to diminish, to reduce humanity to something lesser than the empire it had become. For 3 hours, the representatives of Earth had endured this treatment, their faces betraying nothing but patient attention, their responses measured and diplomatic. The other species in attendance had grown accustomed to this demeanor from the humans, this endless well of politeness that seemed inexhaustible, this willingness to absorb insult after insult with nothing more than a gentle correction or a soft-spoken clarification. The Valorians had been building toward this moment for months, ever since humanity had refused to relinquish their claim to the Kepler Traverse, a region of space that held strategic importance for both civilizations. What the Valorians failed to understand, what perhaps all the assembled species failed to grasp, was that human politeness was not weakness. It was not submission. It was a choice, a deliberate and conscious decision to extend grace even when grace was not deserved. Ambassador Chen had been raised in the diplomatic corps, trained from youth to represent her species with dignity and restraint, taught that words could build bridges where weapons could only create graves. She believed in this philosophy with every fiber of her being, had dedicated her life to proving that humanity could rise above its violent past and become something better, something worthy of respect among the stars. But even the deepest wells can run dry. Even the strongest bridges can bear only so much weight before the foundations begin to crack. The Valerian magistrate made his fatal error when he departed from political rhetoric and ventured into personal attack. He spoke of Ambassador Chen's family, stationed on the colony world of New Vancouver. He mentioned them by name, her husband Marcus, her daughter Lynn, her son David. He spoke of how fragile colony worlds could be, how easily accidents could happen, how unfortunate it would be if something were to befall such innocent civilians. The words were couched in the language of hypothetical concern, but the threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air like poison gas. Ambassador Chen's expression did not change immediately. For several seconds, she remained perfectly still, her face a mask of diplomatic neutrality. The assembled delegates began to murmur, sensing that some line had been crossed but unsure of its significance. The Thalasian observers, with their gift for reading emotional resonance, were the first to notice the shift. Their chromatic scales began flickering in patterns of alarm, ancient instincts recognizing what their conscious minds could not yet articulate. Something was changing in the human ambassador, some fundamental transformation occurring beneath the surface of that carefully maintained composure. The air in the chamber seemed to grow heavier, charged with an electricity that had not been present moments before. When Ambassador Chen finally spoke, her voice was different. The gentle modulation was gone, replaced by something colder, harder, a tone that carried the weight of 10,000 years of human warfare, of species survival, of a race that had clawed its way from the caves to the stars through sheer determination and controlled ferocity. The politeness had not faded gradually. It had not diminished by degrees. It had simply switched off, like a light being extinguished, revealing something that had been there all along, waiting beneath the surface. She began to speak, and with each word, the council began to understand what they had done. They had mistaken restraint for incapacity. They had confused civilization with domestication. They had forgotten that humanity had not evolved to be apex predators by accident, that every diplomatic smile concealed teeth that had been sharpened across millennia of conflict. The words that followed would be transcribed and studied by xenoanthropologists for generations, analyzed for their linguistic precision and their devastating effectiveness. Ambassador Chen did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The authority in her tone was absolute, the kind of certainty that comes from speaking not as an individual but as the voice of an entire species that has collectively decided that enough is enough. She addressed the Valerian magistrate directly, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made the reptilian diplomat physically recoil in his seat. She spoke of the human concept of the social contract, of the unspoken agreements that allow civilized beings to coexist peacefully, of the boundaries that must never be crossed if that civilization is to endure. She explained, with clinical precision, exactly what the magistrate had done by threatening her family, how he had violated every principle that held the council together, how he had mistaken human patience for human weakness. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop as she continued speaking, laying out the consequences of the magistrate's words with the methodical care of a surgeon making an incision. She detailed the military capabilities that humanity had deliberately chosen not to deploy, the weapon systems that remained in reserve not because they were inadequate but because they were excessive, the tactical doctrines that had been developed during the Earth's various conflicts and then carefully shelved in the name of peaceful coexistence. She spoke of the human tendency toward disproportionate response when certain lines were crossed, the historical pattern of measured diplomacy followed by overwhelming force when diplomacy failed. The assembled delegates listened in growing horror as she painted a picture not of threats but of simple facts, of capabilities and doctrines and the mathematics of warfare. The Thalasian scales had gone completely dark, their species equivalent of shock. The Mendari delegation had ceased their constant chittering, their compound eyes fixed on the human ambassador with something approaching religious awe. Even the elders of Proxima, who had seen empires rise and fall across the centuries, sat forward in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in galactic history. Ambassador Chen moved from the specific to the general, addressing not just the Valerian threat but the broader pattern of disrespect that humanity had endured since joining the Council. She spoke of trade agreements that had been subtly weighted against human interests, of cultural dismissals and casual prejudices, of the thousand small ways that the established powers had sought to keep humanity in its place, to ensure that the newcomers understood their position in the hierarchy. She acknowledged that humanity had accepted these slights, had chosen to absorb them in the interest of building lasting relationships, of proving themselves worthy of partnership. But she made it clear, with devastating precision, that acceptance had been a choice, not a necessity. Humanity did not need the Council. The Council had simply been a more pleasant path than the alternatives. She spoke of the human colonies that were thriving independently, of the technological advances that Earth had shared freely when they could have been hoarded as strategic advantages, of the military restraint that humanity had exercised in dozens of border disputes when overwhelming force would have been easier and more satisfying. Every example she cited drove home the same point: human politeness was a gift, not a weakness, and gifts could be withdrawn. The Valerian magistrate attempted to interrupt, to reassert control of the proceedings, but Ambassador Chen cut him off with a gesture so sharp and commanding that he fell silent immediately. She informed him that his diplomatic credentials were being revoked, that the Valerian Empire had 72 hours to issue a formal apology and guarantee the safety of every human civilian in contested space, and that failure to comply would result in consequences that she detailed with chilling specificity. She spoke of economic sanctions that would cripple Valerian trade, of intelligence assets that would be activated to expose corruption within their government, of military repositioning that would make their strategic holdings untenable. She was not threatening. She was informing. She was explaining the natural consequences of actions already taken, the inevitable results of choices already made. The transformation that had begun with Ambassador Chen spread through the chamber like wildfire. The other human delegates, who had maintained their diplomatic postures throughout the preceding hours, now sat differently in their chairs. Their spines were straighter, their gazes more direct, their body language communicating a unified front that had not been visible before. It was as if a collective decision had been made, as if some signal had passed between them that the time for endless patience had expired. The junior attaché from the Mars delegation, a young woman named Keiko Tanaka, rose from her seat without being recognized by the chair, a breach of protocol so profound that it caused audible gasps from several delegations. She walked to stand beside Ambassador Chen, her movement deliberate and purposeful, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same steel that had entered her superior's tone. Attaché Tanaka addressed the Council about the human understanding of proportional response, about the doctrine that had governed humanity's military actions since the unification wars had finally ended. She explained that humans had learned, through bitter experience, that conflicts escalate when aggression goes unanswered, that the most effective way to prevent violence is to make the cost of aggression unambiguous and absolute. She spoke of the human fleets that had been conducting training exercises in neighboring sectors, exercises that could be concluded and redirected with a single command. She mentioned the names of 17 Valerian military installations, reading off their coordinates with casual precision, making it clear that humanity's intelligence apparatus was far more comprehensive than anyone had suspected. The message was unmistakable: humanity had been playing by the Council's rules, but they had not forgotten how to play by their own. The Mendari ambassador, who had always maintained cordial relations with Earth, rose to speak in what appeared to be an attempt at mediation. But Ambassador Chen fixed him with a look that stopped his words before they could form. She reminded him, gently but firmly, that the Mendari had voted against human inclusion in the resource-sharing agreement 6 months prior, that they had lobbied against Earth's proposal for refugee protections, that their merchants had been caught price-fixing against human colonies on 3 separate occasions. She was not angry. She was simply no longer pretending not to notice. The facade of diplomatic blindness had been lifted, and every slight, every manipulation, every casual dismissal now stood exposed in the harsh light of honest accounting. The Mendari ambassador sat down heavily, his mandibles clicking in distress. One by one, Ambassador Chen addressed each delegation that had, in small ways or large, taken advantage of human forbearance. She did not threaten. She simply reminded them of facts they had thought were forgotten or forgiven, debts both literal and metaphorical that humanity had chosen not to collect. The Proximan elders received a reminder that the terraforming technology they now employed had been human innovation, shared freely when it could have been sold at enormous profit. The Cillian Collective was informed that humanity had evidence of their treaty violations in the outer reaches, evidence that had been filed away rather than prosecuted in the interest of maintaining harmony. Each revelation was delivered with clinical detachment, but the cumulative effect was devastating. The Council was beginning to understand the true cost of the gift they had been receiving, the patience they had been taking for granted. The chamber had fallen into complete silence now, broken only by Ambassador Chen's voice as she continued her accounting. She spoke of the human perspective on friendship, on the distinction between allies who stood together in adversity and partners who merely shared convenience. She made it clear that humanity was reassessing every relationship, every agreement, every treaty in light of this moment. The polite assumptions were being stripped away. The benefit of the doubt was being withdrawn. From this point forward, humanity would engage with the galaxy not as supplicants seeking acceptance but as equals demanding respect. The choice of how that engagement would proceed, she explained, now rested entirely with the other species of the Council. Humanity had extended its hand in friendship. Whether that hand continued to offer partnership or closed into a fist would depend entirely on the decisions made in the next 72 hours. The Valerian magistrate, his confidence completely shattered, made one final attempt to salvage the situation. He stood, his voice shaking slightly, and began to speak about the long history of Valerian civilization, about their contributions to galactic peace, about the need for measured responses to what he attempted to characterize as a simple misunderstanding. Ambassador Chen allowed him to speak for perhaps 30 seconds before she interrupted him with a single word delivered with such finality that it seemed to physically stop the air in the chamber. She informed him that his time to speak had expired when he had chosen to threaten innocent civilians, that nothing he said now would alter the trajectory of the next 72 hours, and that his continued presence in the chamber was no longer required or desired. She gestured to the human security detail that had, until this moment, maintained an almost invisible presence at the edges of the assembly. The security officers moved with the fluid precision of trained military personnel, their movement synchronized in a way that spoke of countless hours of drilling and preparation. They did not touch the Valerian magistrate, but their positioning made it clear that his options were limited. He could leave under his own power, or he could be removed. The choice was his, but the outcome was predetermined. As he gathered his materials and departed the chamber, his gait stiff with humiliation, the assembled delegates witnessed something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of humanity. They saw that human restraint was not passivity, that human politeness was not subservience, that the gentle diplomacy they had grown accustomed to was a choice that could be unmade in an instant when the circumstances demanded it. Ambassador Chen resumed her address to the council, but her tone had shifted once more, becoming less confrontational and more explanatory. She spoke now as if to students who had misunderstood a fundamental lesson, her words carrying a weight of disappointment that was somehow more cutting than anger would have been. She explained that humanity had come to the stars with hope, with genuine belief that the species of the galaxy could build something better together than any could achieve alone. She described the idealism of the early ambassadors, the determination to prove that Earth's violent history was not destiny but merely prologue, that humanity could evolve beyond its baser instincts and become worthy partners in a community of civilized beings. That hope had not died, she assured the assembly, but it had been tested, strained to the breaking point by casual disrespect and deliberate exploitation. The human approach to diplomacy, she explained, was rooted in a concept that many species seemed to misunderstand. Humans believed in giving respect freely, in offering trust as a starting point rather than an earned reward. But that trust was not infinite. That respect was not unconditional. When it became clear that forbearance was interpreted as weakness, that generosity was seen as foolishness, then the fundamental assumptions underlying human diplomacy had to be reassessed. She spoke of the concept of reciprocity, of the human expectation that relationships should be mutually beneficial, that power differentials should not translate into exploitation, that the strong had obligations to the weak rather than rights over them. These were human values, she acknowledged, and perhaps not all species shared them. But humanity would no longer subsidize relationships that violated these principles. The Thalasian ambassador, whose species had maintained genuine friendship with humanity since first contact, rose to speak, his scales flickering with patterns of concern and solidarity. He addressed the council, his voice resonating with harmonics that conveyed emotional depth beyond mere words. He spoke of his species' observations of humanity, of the restraint they had witnessed, of the provocations that had been absorbed without response. He validated Ambassador Chen's account, confirming instances that many delegations had likely hoped were private. The Thalasians, he explained, had long wondered when humanity would finally assert itself, when the polite mask would slip to reveal the determined species beneath. He expressed not shock at this moment but relief that it had finally arrived, that honest relationships could now be built on realistic foundations rather than diplomatic fictions. As the session continued, something remarkable began to occur. One by one, ambassadors from the smaller delegations, species that had also felt the weight of the Council's established hierarchies, began to speak in support of humanity's position. The Kepler Coalition representatives, whose species had been systematically marginalized in resource allocation debates, stood to offer their solidarity. The Dracian communes, whose cultural practices had been dismissed as primitive by the older species, added their voices to the growing chorus. What had begun as a confrontation between humanity and the Valerian Empire was transforming into something far more significant, a fundamental challenge to the power structures that had governed galactic politics for millennia. The established powers watched with growing alarm as their carefully maintained order began to fracture along lines they had not anticipated. Ambassador Chen recognized the moment for what it was and carefully steered the energy in the chamber toward constructive rather than destructive ends. She proposed a reformation of the Council's charter, a comprehensive review of the treaties and agreements that governed interspecies relations, with particular attention to provisions that disproportionately benefited the founding species at the expense of newer members. She suggested the formation of a commission, with equal representation from established and emerging civilizations, to oversee this process and recommend changes. The proposal was masterful in its construction, offering a path forward that allowed the older species to save face while addressing the fundamental inequities that had created the current crisis. It was an olive branch extended from a position of strength, a demonstration that humanity's departure from politeness did not mean abandonment of civilization. The vote on Ambassador Chen's proposal revealed the true state of galactic politics in a way that years of diplomatic maneuvering had obscured. The motion passed overwhelmingly, with only the Valerian Empire and two of their closest allies voting in opposition. The established powers, recognizing that they could either adapt to the new reality or face a coalition of emerging civilizations led by an increasingly assertive humanity, chose pragmatism over pride. The Proximan elders, in a gesture that surprised many observers, not only voted in favor but offered to host the initial meetings of the proposed commission, lending their considerable prestige to the reform effort. It was an acknowledgement, subtle but unmistakable, that the old order could not hold, that humanity had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the galaxy not through military force but through the credible threat of withdrawing the gifts they had been providing. As the session drew to a close and the delegates began to depart, Ambassador Chen remained at her podium, accepting the approaches of various ambassadors who sought to clarify their positions, to offer assurances, to rebuild bridges that had been strained by the day's events. She greeted each with courtesy, but the nature of that courtesy had changed. There was a guardedness now, a careful assessment behind every smile, a clear understanding that trust once broken must be actively rebuilt rather than simply assumed. The Valerian delegation departed without attempting to approach, their ambassador having been recalled to their homeworld to face consequences for his catastrophic miscalculation. Within the 72-hour deadline, a formal apology would be issued, reparations would be offered, and guarantees would be provided. The Valerian Empire had learned what many species throughout human history had discovered, that pushing humanity to the point where polite mode switches off is a mistake that is rarely made twice. The recordings of that session would become required viewing in diplomatic academies across the galaxy, studied as a master class in the exercise of soft power, in the strategic deployment of capability revelation, in the precise calibration of response that achieves objectives without unnecessary escalation. But the true lesson, the one that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come, was simpler and more profound. Humanity had demonstrated that civilization does not require submission, that politeness is not weakness, that a species can be both diplomatic and dangerous, both restrained and ready. They had shown the galaxy their teeth not by bearing them in aggression but by choosing, deliberately and consciously, to stop hiding them behind diplomatic smiles. And in that moment, the Council had witnessed not the beginning of humanity's fall into barbarism but rather the full emergence of Earth as a mature power, confident enough to demand respect, strong enough to enforce boundaries, and wise enough to prefer partnership over domination. The polite mode had not disappeared. It had simply been revealed as a choice, a gift that humanity extended to those who proved themselves worthy of receiving it, and the galaxy would never make the mistake of taking that gift for granted again.